the role of the NHS Pay Review Body makes recommendations to the Prime Minister, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care here in England, the First Minister in Scotland, the First Minister in Wales, and the Minister of Health in Northern Ireland on all staff under the Agenda for Change programme and employed in the NHS. There is a separate pay review body that looks at doctors and dentists. So I just want to make clear to those watching that that is what the NHS PRB is about. Obviously there are wider issues in workforce at the moment across the NHS. They're not all the responsibility of our guests today. So just before we introduce them, I think one of our members, Rachel Maskell, wanted to put a declaration on the record.
I'm a member of Unite the Union and the GMB, and I was former head of health at Unite and have submitted evidence, including all evidence, to the pay review body.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have Philippa Hurd with us, who's chair of the NHS Pay Review Body, and we have David Fry, who's the Director of Office of Manpower Economics at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Thank you so much to both of you for making time coming in to speak to the Select Committee this morning. I know there's a lot of interest in this session outside and inside Parliament, so we really appreciate your time. Philippa, if I may start with yourself as chair, what do you think the greatest misunderstanding is about the NHS Pay Review Body? Is it about its independence? Is it what it cannot do? What's the greatest misunderstanding?
Right. I think perhaps before I dive into that, it's worth a couple of sentences of context. So I'm here on behalf of the Pay Review Body, and I hope the session is useful to the committee. You'll be aware that this is my last of 6 years as chair of the Pay Review Body. So in the first 3 years, our reports focused on commentary on a 3-year deal that was made between the parties, and we returned to making recommendations in 2021 and 2022, and we're currently in the process of our work for a report for 2023. So that's probably helpful context. And we have remits, as you say, from the UK government in respect of the NHS in England and from Wales and Northern Ireland. What we essentially do, we do three things. We produce a body of evidence, I suppose a curated body which is useful over time, which details a full range of analysis of the NHS workforce, particularly as regards to pay, but all the factors that relate to pay. We make recommendations in any one specific year about an award in that year. And then we also do our best to inform government thinking about pay and the case for investment in pay in the longer term. So I think it's probably important for us that those three quite separate things are well understood.
You've probably heard your name and your organisation being quoted, talked about, discussed on the media a lot over the course of the Christmas and New Year holiday period in particular and since. And I'm sure you have had many phone calls asking you to go on and take part in that. But what have you heard on the radio and in discussion about the NHS Pay Review Body that you've thought, no, I'm sorry, that's just plain wrong?
We set out our recommendations in quite a lot of detail, huge detail actually, probably, in our report, and so there are obviously occasions when I think I do wonder if you've read the report, and so I think one of my wishes over the last couple of months is that the people making the commentary had read the report.
Interesting. Well, for the record, I have read your last report. It's 188 pages.
Yeah,
and
we really aim to please.
I've made this case to many journalists over the course of the last few months that have you. They never quite answer. But anyway, just as a follow-up from me, so given that the joint NHS trade unions have written to the Secretary of State and written to you in the last few weeks, just ahead of the deadline for submission of evidence to this year's round, basically saying that they're boycotting this year's pay review. We've got a major problem, haven't we?
So the staff side have said they are not taking part. They have very helpfully put a significant amount of material in the public domain on which we will be able to draw. Some unions are taking part.
Okay. So who is taking part?
Well, those unions have chosen not to put the evidence in the public domain yet, but we have had evidence from some unions. The other way in which we listen to the voice of staff, you'll be aware that one of the things we do is visit a wide range of NHS settings, so acute, community settings. And when we do that, each visit, and we visit in Northern Ireland, Wales and England, we talk to staff at every level in the organisation. So we have small focus groups, clinical and non-clinical, at all pay bands. So we have in-depth discussions with staff, and they tell us how they feel about their work and about their pay. So we do get a fair amount of good quality input from staff.
So you get the wider context, because of course
Yes.
a lot of the people that we've heard talking about the industrial action over recent weeks have sort of said, look, yes, it's about pay, but it's about much wider than that, and you get that context. I just wonder, because I said at the outset, which I think is important context for viewers, that the doctors, the dentists, and obviously the junior doctors are currently waiting on the outcome of their ballot, and you're not responsible for their pay award. But do you talk to them? Because obviously they're part of that health economy in a hospital when you go and visit it, and therefore they will have a view on the agenda for change pay rates and how that impacts on their ability to do their jobs.
You'll be aware that doctors and dentists and NHS and the Agenda for Change pay spine are handled quite separately, and we don't talk to doctors, no. We do talk to the senior leadership team in each of the hospitals and healthcare settings we go to, because we want to understand their view about recruitment and retention, motivation and morale, and what's happening to their staff. And you're right, staff tell us about a broad range of challenges, but our job is pay, and so we do try and focus the conversation on that.
Okay, all right. We'll come back to some of these later on, but we're going to go round the table if that's okay. So first up is Paul Blockfield.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks very much for spending time with us this morning. I guess everybody recognises what a challenging job you've got. Part of that challenge, I guess, is how you balance the different considerations that you're charged with bearing in mind, and there are clearly several. I mean, taking three: recruitment and retention, the funds available, the government's inflation target. Squaring that circle in reaching a recommendation sounds pretty impossible in many ways. How do you balance those different objectives?
I wonder if it's helpful to talk a little bit about the process by which we do that, because we don't just do it in one conversation. The whole process is about balancing those objectives. Is it worth just doing that? So, as I've talked about our visits, so it starts with the visits, which are usually in the kind of late summer, autumn of the year. So we've just finished our visits for this year. Then we tend to get a remit letter. If I can, it's worth talking a little about the timing of the remit letters, but maybe we can come on to that later. But we get a remit letter this year. It came in late November. At that point, we make requests for evidence from the parties to our report, so that's the government, employers, staff side. And we also start collecting our own evidence, so we look very widely at all the commentators. We look for our own economic evidence. That evidence comes in over a period of a few weeks. We do what we can ahead of the remit letter to socialise what we're going to need, and so people are prepared to give us what we need. We then assess that evidence together, so we all work together. And you're right, some of these things are very difficult to find an answer that comfortably reconciles some very, very difficult things. We then have a process of oral evidence. And that's our opportunity to talk with and Rachel, you may have been to oral evidence sessions, to talk about in detail about some elements of the evidence. By that point, usually the parties have seen each other's evidence, they may have views on each other's evidence, and so that process goes into some detail. And there are also, at that point, sometimes we have specific questions that we decide we want to ask all parties in the same way. So last year, for example, we asked about the bottom of pay band 2 and minimum wage, national living wage considerations, as a question for all parties, because we felt it was an area for development. When we've completed all of that, and we have a lot of data and a lot of evidence, then we work to develop the key themes, the key things that we think impact on the report, and we aim to reach consensus about the both the data, as I said, are the three things we do: the data picture, the complete picture, about a number, and about the other considerations we think are important in the medium term. That's the process by which we do it.
Thanks very much for that. It's, I guess, understanding how that works in kind of finishing the judgments, and how far the government, as a critical stakeholder in that entire process, shapes thinking. I mean, I'm minded to kind of reference the letter that you got from the then Secretary of State kicking off the 2022-23 pay round, in which he said it's vital that planned workforce growth is affordable and within the budgets set. And in his third paragraph went on to emphasise we must ensure the affordability of a pay award. That's a pretty clear steer, isn't it? How do you respond to that?
Well, it's one of our considerations, but you'll be aware that in the two recommendations that we've done recently, we recommended more than the government said they could afford. So in 2020, they said they could afford 1%, and we recommended 3%. And in 2022, they said they could afford 2%, but had set aside another 1% of the contingency, and we recommended 4.8%. So it is a consideration. It's an important consideration, but there are others that balance it, and we set out very clearly our real concerns about recruitment and retention, which we felt meant that there were a real counter to that affordability line.
Thank you.
And of course, it's worth saying, isn't it, that the government can accept your report in full without funding it in full. So it could accept your recommendation and say to the department that we accept it in full, but you then have to fund it from existing budgets.
Which is indeed what happened this year.
Exactly. Okay, Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Chair. What if I could just direct or ask you a little bit about what some people have said about your role and what you do. So Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, said that your processes have degenerated into farce, that you are long past your sell-by date, and that you're a willing partner in working to the government's pay cuts agenda. Do you think that's fair?
I'm going to turn to David, actually.
That's what he said.
Because I think that it's probably right that the person who looks at all the pay review bodies comments on what issues of independence.
Okay. Thank you, Philippa. And just to say, so I'm the director of the OME, and we provide the secretariat to the 8 public sector pay review bodies, so that includes the nurses, and then other groups such as teachers, armed forces, and the like. and together, the pay review bodies influence the pay of about 2.2 million public sector workers. So it's about 45% of the public sector. And the review bodies have been around quite a while. So the NHS report, the last one was the 35th report. And the review bodies have endured over time, and different ones have been created by different governments. And the most recent one being, I think, 2014, when the police review body was created. So, from my sense, they must be doing something that's right and helping things work forward.
You wouldn't say it's fair to say that you're a willing partner in working to the government's pay cuts agenda?
Well, and what I was going to say is I think that, you know, the review body is in that tricky position that it's between the unions and between government, but the members of the review body are all appointed independently.
It's not fair.
So I think that, you know, it's the different parties will have their views, and they will say them. You know, as the chair said, over Christmas we saw lots of views.
All right, I won't embarrass anymore by repeating the thing of fair, but I think we pretty much know that it's not fair. Because I want to talk a little bit about your career, if I may, Mrs. Hurd. You're the chair and the pro-chancellor of the University of Manchester. You're a senior independent director and remuneration committee chair of Ordnance Survey, a non-executive director of UK Strategy Command, and an independent member of the Remunerations Committee of St Edmund's College, Cambridge. There was a lot of word independent there, I felt. So when you're called, when it says your processes are rigged, and the idea that you are independent is farcical, then what would you say to that? And that was said by Andy Prendergast of the GMB.
I think quite a lot about the issue of independence and how you actually make it happen. So I wonder if it's helpful talking about that.
Yes, very helpful.
So one of the ways in which you're independent is you're not part of it. You're not part of the organisation. So any of the organisations involved, we're not part of those. So we are technically independent. The other way in which you're independent, and this is one of the things I think about quite a lot in relation to independence, is you have to take information from a very broad range of sources. So some people, I think, see independence as being completely apart from something. You actually have to know and understand something in order to make judgments about it. And one of the challenges, one of the reasons you have term limits, for example, in that, you know, if you spend too long with something, you get to know it too well and you can't be independent from it. But you do have to know it fairly well. And so one of the ways in which we're independent is we take very seriously evidence from all the parties involved.
Yes.
And we also choose to get evidence from a wide range of other independent sources. So we'll get economic evidence, we get evidence from think tanks, and we look at all of that evidence with care and thoughtfulness, and we look at it together. So we have different perspectives on that. And then the third way in which you exercise independence is by making decisions.
So just my last question. I just want you to confirm, if you may, that you're operating to the same terms and conditions that were set in 2007 when the body was set up. And again, just see if you would like to comment on the fact that you were called human shields by the TUC's Paul Novak.
In 2007?
Well, so it says you're operating at the same terms and conditions now that you were in 2007. Just want to make sure that's confirmed, because that's what I've picked up today in the notes. So you're operating to the same terms and conditions that were set in 2007.
Do you mean terms of reference?
Yes. Sorry, terms and reference.
The terms of reference. Sorry, David,
Forgive
I wonder
me.
if you want to comment on our terms of reference, because they apply to, I think, most of the paper.
Sorry, forgive me. Terms of reference.
Sorry.
So yes, broadly the same terms of reference have been operating then, yes, since that time, and each year there is also an independent, there's a remit. And just coming back to your point about independence, I think the point is that all of the members of the review body are appointed through an open and transparent process and are overseen by the Public Appointments Committee. So, and they're all appointed because of their backgrounds, and they're not representing, for example, a trade union. We have a member of that background on there. We have members from all different groups, but they're not representing those particular groups.
Thank you very much.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for that, Paul. You are acutely aware of how political a position that you are finding yourself in, even though you are clearly not political, and neither of you are. But you know, you have one of the most important jobs in the country right now, which is why there's so much interest in this. And you know, some of those quotes that my colleague has just read out, I mean, they're pretty
horrible. They're
pretty harsh, aren't they? They're pretty horrible and harsh to say that you're effectively Tory stooges, just doing the government's bidding. And it must be quite annoying, considering you are somebody of independent stature with a very impressive CV and work that you've done and continue to do. I mean, it must be quite annoying.
It's an odd thing, isn't it? We have, and it's going to sound a bit folksy, but I think that we have a privilege in having all this information and pulling it together and then laying it before Parliament in a completely open way. And so we really do show our working out in, as you say, some detail. And I think that what we've tried to do during this process, because we're obviously now in the process for 2023, is just do what we do and carry on with assessing the evidence, listening to staff in trust, which is what we've been doing over this last few months, and keeping focused on the work.
Fascinating. Maybe some of the camera crews that spend a lot of time in emergency departments should spend some time following you. Don't answer that. Right, James Morris is
just a short. So, Sid, I think I heard you say that one of the processes that you go through is seeking consensus on the judgment you've come to in terms of pay. How do you go about trying to get consensus?
With the 8 Pay Review Body members, well, we work very carefully together at every stage. So we read all the papers, and there are thousands of pages of papers together. We page sent together. We interview everyone together. At key stages, we check understanding. How does everyone feel about this? What are people's concerns? Where are the key areas we need to develop further? So that by the time we get to the stage that we've finished our taking oral evidence, we then assemble all the evidence in one place, because that goes in a reasonably coherent form in the report. And then we, as I said, we work on the themes together, so that by the time we actually get to make our recommendations, we have developed a collective view about the various different issues, and we then have a process of coming to the same view on key issues like the number, like the issues on which we think there needs to be more developed work. So you will be aware that 2 years ago and last year we asked for a review of the banding of nurses and midwives, because we were concerned that it's a very long time since that banding was set. The interim nursing has become a graduate profession. We were concerned that it was a long time since anyone had looked at whether the banding accurately reflected the complexities of the job as it's done today. So, that's the kind of thing that would emerge as we're developing our consensus.
On Mr. Morris's point about consensus, are you like the Bank of England in that you have a decision to make as a group and then you vote and you publish where the balance was within the group, or do you exercise collective responsibility?
We come to a decision together.
Okay.
We don't vote.
And if it was do you show your workings out in terms of how people dissented or otherwise before you get, or is it like cabinet? In 30 years' time, we'll find out.
We come to a consensus. We do come to a collective view, or we have done.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I can't speak for other peer review bodies, but that's what we do.
And you don't leak. Interesting. Lucy, Alan.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. Are you still working towards an April 23 deadline as set out in the remit? So can I ask, has the government provided you with the evidence that you need yet?
No.
No. And how is that then going to impact on your process, and will it actually delay your findings?
I wonder if this is a good moment to talk. I'll come back to the question, definitely, but I wonder if it's a good moment to talk about timing. Because you will have seen in last year's in the 2021 report and in 2022 report that we set out our concerns about the timing of the process as it has evolved. So historic practice, traditional practice has been that the Pay Review Body would get a remit letter in September. which allowed us then to do our work so that we could report in the early part of the year, and that had two benefits. One, it meant that Agenda for Change staff got their pay award when it was due on the 1st of April, or there was an opportunity to do that. And secondly, that our findings could influence budget setting and thinking about the balance of investment of pay versus other things you might invest in, infrastructure and technology, etc. In the last 2 years, our remit letters come in at the end of November.
End of
November, which sets us back a long way and means that it's impossible for us to report in time for any award due to be paid on the 1st of April, and for any information we give to inform ministers as they're planning their budgets. So I think that it's a specific timing concern which we set out now 2 years running, and I'm really hoping that going forward we can bring that timetable forward.
So it was due to be submitted on the 11th of January, the government's input.
So the government's evidence. It was due on the 11th of a few days before that, I wrote to the Minister to reiterate the importance of the deadline, and he wrote back straight away confirming that he understood the importance of the deadline. We had pretty much by the deadline, actually, we had some really timely evidence this year. So we've been working with the evidence we've got. We have oral evidence that starts next week. It's not unusual for evidence to come late. As I said, this year it's been very timely. In previous years, we've expressed in our report a number of times real gratitude to parties who have been very flexible about timing, so that we've been able to absorb some evidence that has been late. And we're carrying on working with our current timetable, and we're not at the moment planning to put anything back.
So April 23, you will be ready to report?
We are aiming to report by the end of April 23, yes.
And if the government doesn't, I mean, it's February tomorrow, if the government doesn't provide the relevant evidence, surely it's going to impact on your process?
I'm still expecting evidence of the government. If it doesn't come, we'll deal with that. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, and I've got one further question, if I may. Is it really realistic for the government to expect the PRB to take account of wider economic circumstances such as inflation? I mean, do you have the expertise within the organisation to be able to factor that into your deliberations?
We have two economists who are Pay Review Body members. One is a labour market economist, another is a very experienced general economist, and they make a very substantial contribution to our work.
Thanks, Lucy. I saw it in the notes beforehand that the government hadn't responded by the time of this session, so 21 days after the deadline that was due. I'm astonished that you've been able to confirm that today. I mean, having spent all the holiday season since the remit letter, effectively standing behind the Pay Review Body, to then not respond to it by the date that you asked for, I mean, that must... You're saying we hope to hear from the government, but you don't have to hear from the government, do you? I mean, they don't have to respond to you. I mean, this must be intolerable. I mean, what would your message be to the Secretary of State, who I assure you we will be asking this afternoon? What would your message be? To get his skates on, I presume?
We're carrying on with our work. I've already written to the Minister to express my concerns about the deadline. We're carrying on doing what we do, and we will. We're being as flexible as we can be, in order to make sure we get our report done on time.
You're missing it's like saying we're making chocolate without cocoa beans, isn't it? You're missing a big gap.
I'm expecting to get evidence from the government. We have had Treasury evidence.
You have had Treasury evidence?
We have had Treasury. All the Pay Review bodies have had Treasury evidence, yes.
Right.
So it's not that we have no evidence of the government, we just don't have evidence from the Department of Health.
Right, we'll take it up. Rachel Maskell next.
Thank you ever so much. Clearly, the department provides information on some of the challenges facing the NHS at this time, and I think it's fair to say that with the recruitment and retention issues and also the issues of motivating staff, which is one of the matters that the pay review body has to look at, is that this is the most challenged time since Agenda for Change has been put in place. Have you got the balances right when you are seeing NHS staff saying that they can't maintain their services anymore because of the retention issues? There are recruitment challenges and morale is at an all-time low.
It's a difficult balance, and you'll see that we set out our concerns about recruitment and retention in the report. You'll also see that we said that we would be prepared at any time to look at recruitment and retention recruitment and retention premia in the event that the situation worsened. It was a difficult balance. It is a difficult balance.
Also, we've got the most volatile economic time as well, and just to look at the 22-23 year report, and if we think about the remit letter coming out in November, since we've experienced energy prices rising, we've seen inflation going into double digits, and the cost of commodities rising sharply too. Do you think the time lag has had an impact on why there is a dispute currently over pay? That's a time lag to your point of reporting and clearly the situation we're in now.
We were very concerned about inflation for obvious reasons when we were doing our last report. We had a remit for report in that year, but our concerns about inflation, together with other issues, were significantly influenced our decision to recommend a flat cash award last year, so that those on the lower pay points would have more resilience in relation to inflation. We were particularly concerned about the inflation impact on those on the lower pay points. So that's why we focused the recommendation on those areas. We've now got a recommendation to prepare for this year, and in doing that we'll look at what's happened to pay from all kinds of employers in the intervening time.
In the light that clearly over the last 13 years there's been significant regression in pay for NHS professionals, and we know that across the board, nurses saying 19% is what they were seeking initially with the resolution of the current dispute, and we know across the board that there has been significant loss in the real value of those jobs. How do you look at historic loss with comparison to the rest of the economy, and whether or not the remit letter is restraining your opportunity to address that disparity, and particularly noting that that has now led to a significant accumulation which has brought about this dispute, which is ongoing at the moment?
Okay, as I said, we're asked to make a recommendation in a 1 year, and there are a number of considerations we have to work with. What we do try and do is inform longer term thinking in government about the investment in pay and the case for that, hence concerns about nurses' pay, for example. There have been investments in the Agenda for Change pay spine over the last 6 years in particular, so you'll be aware that the 3-year deal awarded or put above inflation investment into the Agenda for Change pay spine over 3 years, and then we also did that in 2021. For the reasons we've talked about, we recommended a flat cash award, again, significantly related to inflation levels. Our concerns about those in 2022. So there has been some ground made up, but more recently that's become more challenged.
Do you believe, as a pay review body, that you clearly handed a remit letter which has real significance about the scope of what you can recommend? Do you believe that you're restrained in the recommendation that you would want to provide because of that remit letter? So in some ways you're handed the envelope and you've been asked to sort out the distribution, but actually you don't have sufficient scope to say the real economic benefit that we could bring to the wider NHS, to the wider economy, if we could perhaps not have that cap being placed on you. And actually to make that form of recommendation could be a way of looking at how you can address the real value or the real loss of value in the pay which NHS staff receive.
I think there are I'd answer that in two parts. One, we obviously didn't see it as an absolute constraint because we recommended more than the government said they could afford, and that was for the reasons that we said. We do try to set out the case for investment in pay, and we will continue to do that. There is a constraint created by the amount of money that the government say they have available, but we set the other considerations alongside that, and in the last 2 years have recommended more than the government say they have available.
Do you acknowledge, however, that that simply hasn't been enough in the light of the recruitment, retention and low morale that we're now seeing being displayed, and that if urgent intervention isn't made in this coming process, that we could be in an even more challenged place in the NHS with regards to recruitment and retention than we have been up to this point, where we've got over 133,500 vacancies?
It's going to sound slightly annoying, but I'm not going to comment on what our recommendations are going to be this year.
Okay. Paulette Hamilton.
Good morning, Philippa. As looking through the notes, I saw a little bit about the Nuffield Trust. They did a blog and they set out that the recommendations, really how the pay review body could improve. They also went on to say that the pay review body needed to be more explicit. So it gave 11 recommendations, but it also said the pay review body needed to be more explicit if there were any affordability envelope restrictions that you had. So my first question is, with this in mind, is there anything the NHS Pay Review Body can do to strengthen its independence from government?
I've read the same Nuffield report. It's only just come out, so what I haven't had a chance to do is talk about it with the peer review body members. So I can't comment widely. Interestingly, they do pick up the timing point that we've just discussed earlier, which is an issue that I have talked to members about. I'm wondering if, David, if you wouldn't mind picking up the Nuffield thing, because as I said, we haven't had a chance to talk about it as a peer review.
And you're right, that's something the review body will have a look at, and there's often views about how the review bodies could work and how they could change. And I think, what's interesting is some of the things they've said that should be done are things that are done by the review body. So, for example, it talks about the review body needing to have access to research. And the way that it works at the moment is that we have a secretariat which includes policy analysts and statisticians and economists who provide advice. So, during the round they will be giving advice on things like international recruitment of nurses, comparisons of pay of the NHS with other workers, and that's all part of what comes in. And indeed in the reports you can see how it explicitly looks at how things like the top and the bottom of the nurses' pay scale, how that has has fared in comparison with inflation and the like. But also beyond that, if the review body want to do another analysis, OME can commission this on their behalf, so we commission external research. So relatively recently I've commissioned research on behalf of all the review bodies looking at apprenticeships and how the impact of apprenticeships on recruitment and retention, because I think apprenticeships are something that's quite important for professions such as the NHS. And indeed, we have recently just commissioned a project on looking at nurse turnover. So that's one of the things that the review body does do at the moment. And as I said, we'll look at it to see what it says. Ultimately, the terms of reference for the review body is for government to look at these things. But as I say, some of these things, the appointment of the review body, we talked about how they're independent, how they come from different backgrounds. Many of these things in there, I think, are things that the current review body does. But the timing is the issue that Philippa mentioned, which I think is an important thing to help people understand the recommendations. So the point that one of your colleagues mentioned earlier, I think the earlier the nearer that recommendations can be made, can be made to the time of when pay is due, and the government can decide on that, and people get the pay in their pay packet at the time that it's due, the better chance that these things will be accepted by people getting the pay rises. So I think there are good things in there to look at.
And my second question, I've heard everything you've said this morning, and I appreciate everything you've said. I'll talk to you, Philippa. But my concern is that over a number of years, although there are many people that feed into the pay review body, the government's voice seems to be the only voice that is truly being heard. And for me, the next question is, do you feel the way the pay body operates is truly open and transparent? Is it truly a fair system for our health workers? And is it outdated?
The process which I've talked about, we go through to gather evidence from all parties, the way in which we consider evidence, the way in which we bring in evidence from other places, feels like a very independent process. We don't agree with the government on affordability considerations, and have recommended on occasions, and have recommended higher levels because we haven't accepted their affordability constraints. We listen hard to a very, very wide range of voices, and we come up with a body of evidence that informs debate generally. We come up with a number in any 1 year, and with what I hope are a series of recommendations about investment in pay that are heard.
I'll tell you the reason why I say all of that, and I'm not having a go, I really am not. But Mr. Hunt, the health secretary that became the member of this committee, you recommended a rise, I think back in 2014, I'm desperately trying to find it, and he disagreed. It just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. So even though the government say you're independent, they put the constraints down, they set the limits. If they don't agree with it, it just doesn't happen. So that's why I'm challenging just how independent and transparent this process truly is. Sorry?
Sorry,
Oh, yeah.
So we make an independent recommendation. The government doesn't have to accept it. Our recommendation is independent. They don't have to accept it. It's their decision.
And just on that, you're right. But since 2010, I think there's been one recommendation that's been turned down by government, and you're right, and that was by the UK government in 2014.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
On advisors advise, ministers decide
Yeah.
principle, that is consistent.
Yes.
Right.
And that's our brief, to make a recommendation.
Okay, so Dr. Caroline Johnson and then Tayo Watemi.
Thank you, Chair. And I probably should say for declaration of interest that I do work as an NHS doctor, and that is assessed by the DDRB, which are not here today but are one of the independent pay review bodies. So just to clarify a point first that Lucy raised, will this delay in receipt of evidence from the Department of Health mean that your recommendations for the uplift in pay received in April will not be received in April? Or will they not be received in April anyway because the process is starting too late as you described?
The process is starting later than previous practice, and on the basis of starting at the end of November, we took the view that we could deliver the report by the end of April. We still haven't had evidence from the government. We are still planning to deliver our report by the end of April.
That is for pay from the next financial year, isn't it? So it's already not going to receive in April's pay rise as it should be. So that's meaning that you're actually behind the curve already. I'm not saying it's your fault, but it is behind the curve already.
As I said, for us to be able to give the recommendation ahead of the curve, we would need to start the process in September.
Very clear, thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was the Agenda for Change package as a whole. So we see on the news the GMB talking about ambulance workers' pay, and we hear about the RCN talking about nurses' pay, as though they were negotiating for all of these groups as separate groups, as though they were paid on different pay scales, but they're not. As we see, there are challenges in retention and recruitment that does differ between the different groups, whether that be ambulance workers, whether that be nurses, whether that be managers, porters, cleaners, or whatever. Do you think it would be easier, and are you constrained from doing, making recommendations for specific working groups? So would you be able to give the nurses a bit more, or is that not possible within the constraints of your AFC?
So you're right. There are in England there are 1.25 million staff on Agenda for Change, of whom 350,000 are nurses. So another 900,000 are not. There is a mechanism that allows you to recommend recruitment and retention premia within Agenda for Change for specific staff groups, and we actually, because we thought it'd be helpful, we set out, I think, in our 2020 report the considerations we'd be looking for to establish recruitment and retention premia. So you can do that.
Fantastic, thank you. The other question I've got is, I've observed over time working on the wards that once a nurse becomes a senior nurse working on a ward, that's a hard job. He or she is working long hours, they're working Christmas, bank holidays, on sociable times of the week. And they can be quite an attractive option to move into a better paid job in a more managerial or supervisory role that doesn't require such antisocial hours. And it seemed to me for a long time that it would be better for patient care if we could incentivise nurses who've learned all those fabulous clinical skills and who really are the nurses which the more junior nurses are able to look up to and learn from, to stay working on those wards with additional monies. Is that something that you're able to look at? Or does the AFC constrain you in that?
No, it's really interesting.
The managerial work seems to be worth more because it gets a higher band.
Actually, what we hear from staff and from the parties at the moment is a different situation. We hear concerns about progression, about abilities to progress, and so people saying that actually the rewards for progression are insufficient. So that's, I mean, we've covered this in the report. So one of our concerns actually, and when we were thinking about banding review, is does the current banding and the way in which the bands work, for example, the gaps between the bands, in fact, create enough of an incentive, enough reward for progression.
I guess it's the same information really, because is it progression between bands 5, 6 and 7?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about between 7 and 8? Because it seems that's the point at which the clinical work largely stops. And actually I could agree that it seems that the rewards for being the nurse in charge of the ward on a night at 3 o'clock in the morning perhaps aren't as great as they should be in terms of progression. But then there's a real incentive to move from that position into a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, office-based role.
Really interesting. It's one of the areas where we get very little, that what happens at Band Aids, one of the areas where we get very little evidence from the parties, and actually we've called this year for more evidence because we think it's an underdeveloped area.
Thank you. My other question is about how you measure things over time. So when I was looking at some of my junior doctor pay slips yesterday evening, which made interesting reading. And it's how you, if I was to compare the pay that I received as a junior doctor with the pay that a junior doctor might receive now, I might think I was comparing the same thing, but in some respects I am, and in some respects I'm not, because at that time there was quite a lot of work went into trying to comply with European Working Time Directives and improve hours. So it was not uncommon for me as a junior doctor to work 16 or even 24 hours in a shift, to work 7 consecutive 13-hour night shifts, and to work 21 days in a row, none of which is allowed under the current rate of banding. And it was common to work more than 58 hours in a week as an average, and now you can't work more than 48. So if I compare the pay now with the pay then, I'm not comparing the same thing. How do you account for when we're looking over time at those changes in paying conditions as well as pay, because those condition changes make working life better, but they do also cost the government or whoever's paying the bill a lot of money?
So the Agenda for Change pay spine has 9 bands on it, and those have points in between them. And jobs are evaluated according to that pay spine. So there's a way in which jobs are assessed to look at their size, and then they're put on the various different bandings. As I said, we've asked for some analysis to be done to check that those are still up to date, because jobs do change. They become more complicated and some become simpler, and things do change. And what we hear from staff in hospitals, and we hear from the parties, is that that generally a feeling is that more work could be done to continually to assess whether jobs are banded at the right level, and accurately to assess whether jobs are banded at the right level. So I think that process does happen, but I generally think the parties' views, I think there would probably be a consensus on this, is that that work could be done more actively.
As well as that, how do you look at the pay over time? Because I could say, well, I was paid, I don't know, say £30,000 for doing some job that was 58 hours a week and arduous hours, and now I'd be paid £32,000 a year. I'm making the numbers as random, for doing a job which is 48 hours a week. So essentially I've had quite a substantial pay rise in that period, because my hourly rate has gone up quite a lot, but the actual headline take home has not really gone up. So how do you look at what is being done for the same amount of money over time when working conditions have formed, particularly medicine, quite a big amount of the improvements?
I'm not sure whether what you're describing in relation to doctors' pay would also be applied for Agenda for Change staff who tend to...
You don't look at working conditions or hours
we look at... we don't look at detailed terms and conditions, hours of work, for example. No one has flagged that as a significant concern, and I think that as jobs change, as they become more or less pressurised, that will be reflected in the way in which individual trusts think about the size of the job. So if a job becomes easier to do, less stressful, less technically difficult, over time a trust will decide that it's no longer a Band 7 job, it's a Band 6 job, for example.
Okay.
So individual trusts will assess the weight of an individual job and put it in a particular banding.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Taiwo Temi.
Thank you, Chair. Philippa, nothing in this world is perfect. Now, you've been chairing the board for 6 years now. Is there anything in the process in which you think that it needs to be adapted, improved, or even just scrapped in order to make it more efficient and to make it better value for money for both staff and taxpayers?
I missed the very beginning of your question.
I just said nothing is perfect.
Oh, right, sorry. So the pay review body process itself. I thought the Nuffield report was really interesting, actually. And I think I would kind of welcome the thoughtful way in which they went about making the recommendations. As David said, some of the things I think we do. I'm always, you mentioned it's quite a long report, and I'm always looking for ways of making it more effective in doing what it does. We look each year at our timetable to look at whether we could compress it. It's a challenge because of that process of needing to be open and everyone else to be able to see everyone else's evidence, and so it's a challenge to compress the timetable, but we do continue to look at that, and actually this year we have tried to make it as compressed as possible. One of the other challenges, actually, to the point about timeliness of evidence, is that if you compress it too much, then you can't afford for anyone to get their evidence, and then things get very difficult very fast. So it's something we think about continually, to be honest, and we're always trying to borrow best practice from each other and learn from each other.
In terms of areas that you think about in terms of improving what you do as a board, have you ever considered having more autonomy in terms of being able to decide, for example, staff benefit for some of the staff within Agenda for Change? So, for example, if I worked for, I don't know, a normal company, as part of my staff pay negotiation, staff benefits is a conversation in terms of what do you offer, because that's also calculated as part of, I guess, pay indirectly. Do you think it's beneficial that you have the powers to be able to recommend some of that within the NHS?
We make a number of observations, and we talk a lot about total reward. The parties are probably quite bored of me talking about total reward, because it's not, what you get paid is incredibly important, but there are a lot of other elements to the working experience, from things like benefits, pensions, through to how you feel about your work and what you do. And so we do make a number of observations about terms and conditions in our reports. So flexibility, I think, is probably the example I would focus on. Flexibility in relation to pensions and flexibility in relation to working hours, both of which are areas where more flexibility would allow the overall NHS pay package to be more compelling. And though we've set both those things out in some detail in the report.
Are there any other areas benefits that you feel like NHS staff would benefit from having, in terms of trying to make the job more competitive compared to other sectors?
What staff tell us when we talk to them is that they feel under a lot of time pressure, and that their working experience is challenging. They talk about wanting quite practical things in their workplace, about wanting space to take time out, access to healthy food, and clarity about when they're working overtime and being paid for overtime. So some of those quite important things are things we make comments on in the report, because they are very important to staff, and in some acute settings where things are very stressful, they don't always get delivered.
Thank you. I just really want to move on to the gender for pay scale, how it works practically. So obviously you've got outside of London weighting scale, and you've got inside of London weighting scale. But the reality is that outside of London is not blank in terms of the cost of living in different areas. It's not the same. if you live down south, most likely your cost of living is going to be a bit more than somebody who lives up north. As you make recommendations to government, is that being factored in terms of how that impacts recruitment and retention within different regions and their ability to be able to retain staff as well?
Yeah, the NHS operates HCAS, which is a high area supplement, essentially, which focuses on London and the immediate surrounds. And the parties have described a number of challenges with HCAS, particularly to do with areas that are actually very expensive. And, occasionally you get trusts that actually border areas where different parts of a trust have to pay people to say. So it's a challenge. So from time to time, peer review bodies are asked to look at specific issues. And that's an example of something that on occasions I would imagine a peer review body might be asked to look at. We said last year that given that there was still quite a lot of settling down post-COVID, where people were working and living, that maybe now wasn't the time to do it. But I think we would always be willing to look at HCAS to see whether it was still fit for purpose. As an example, so a new nurse would earn in the rest of the country just 27,500. In London, they'd earn 30 to 33,000. So quite, there's quite a big difference. But it is a concern for many of the parties involved, and has been as it is for some time.
It is a major concern because if you live in an area like Chichester, cost of living there is significantly more than if you lived in, I want to say, somewhere in Yorkshire. And given the fact that both members of staff will start with about 20. I'm seeing Rachel shake her head that it might be different.
Just to pick a random area.
Just a random area.
Very expensive city.
Just to be able to keep up with the cost of living for staff, that is, quite significant. I just want to move to one last area, which is how you consider NHS transformation projects when putting forward recommendations for staff recruitment and retention. Is that something that's factored in terms of how the NHS is going to be able to get the necessary skill set needed for it to be able to achieve some of the transformation projects that it wants to?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that I found very challenging a couple of years ago is when chief executives who come and talk to us in oral evidence. I should have mentioned it's one of the good things about oral evidence. We get trust chief executives who come and talk to us. One of the chief executives said, I'm so focused on workforce issues, trying to have enough people, that I don't actually have time to think about the transformation things that would improve situations. So I think there is a direct relationship between the having enough people in your hospital to do the work that needs to be done, and your ability to think ahead and move and transform things. So I think there is a relationship between those two things.
Do you consider that in your report, and when you're making? Do you consider that relationship in your report when you are making recommendations?
In what way?
In terms of, so for example, I'm thinking about the fact that NHS is doing their digital transformation project, and that is going to cost a lot, and that's going to require recruiting IT staff who are highly technical. And the reality is, in this country, regardless of what industry you look at, their pay is relatively competitive. So that means as every trust looks at how to implement their digital transformation, they're going to be looking at how to recruit the best, but also within the agenda for scale pathway. So do you consider some of those challenges when looking at recommendations so that each trust is able to achieve their transformation projects?
Absolutely. So a couple of years ago, we were specifically asked to look at IT staff and whether the offer was competitive and whether there was a case for a recruitment and retention premium. We didn't get evidence from the parties to suggest that there was a requirement for a recruitment and retention premium. But we continue to, you'll be aware that NHS X, I think, is now being incorporated into NHS England, and when we assess the evidence from NHS England, those kind of questions are exactly the kind of questions we would discuss.
Okay. So when we spoke to them a couple of weeks ago, I think they did say that there were quite a few challenges with that. So it's something to bear in mind for when next the review is done. But as you can imagine, the landscape has changed so much since COVID, where there's been an over-reliance across all industries on just tech professionals. But that's just one example. There are other professionals within the gender for change structure in which actually their pay may not be as competitive compared to other sectors within the public domain. Chair?
Okay.
Thank you.
As a Ty's final thought. Just a couple of things from me before we close. If from what we've heard, I mean, it's a really excellent questions, and it seems like your work is quite similar to ours in that you open inquiries and take oral evidence and then produce a report. If the pay review body didn't exist, it would have to be invented, wouldn't it?
I'm going to pass that one to David.
I like that. David, you keep getting these hospital passes. but isn't it the case? I mean, the reason, let me just expand on the reason behind my question, is that, we keep hearing, and I've been on the media with other speakers from unions and from other parties, and, the refrain is, ministers should get in the room and negotiate. And I don't know what that means. I mean, does that mean the end of the pay review body? Because, does it mean a dismissal of you and collective bargaining? What if it didn't exist? Wouldn't you have to invent it?
I mean, I think the observation I would make is that these review bodies have been created by governments of both parties over a number of years, and I think that suggests they must be doing something that works over time, because no one has found probably a better way of setting pay for large groups of the public sector. So, it's not my job to decide or recommend on what's the right way of doing it, but my observation would be that the process has endured over time. Obviously, it's had tricky periods, for a review body process to work effectively, you need both parties to be part of it, and these things have changed over time.
So on that, and this sort of follows on from some of the questions from some of my colleagues here, is that, the pay review body process needs some repair, doesn't it? I mean, I think you need to go to the repair shop, because the confidence right now, your body has taken a beating in recent months from some opposition MPs, from some government MPs, from the trade unions, from members of the media, people who haven't read your report, people who have read your report, but it's taken a beating as a process in recent months, so much so that the trade unions are now saying, I appreciate that there are a few who are saying, we're not playing, and therefore the process has got a credibility problem. What would be your suggestion as to how the repair shop can help?
You're going to pass that back to me, aren't you? We're going to carry on doing what we do at the moment, and we're going to carry on with our work, and we're going to carry on producing our report, and if there is an opportunity for government to look at the terms of reference of peer review bodies, which haven't, I don't think, been reviewed since 2007, so maybe it's a moment. I think there's some thoughtful work, and the Nuffield Foundation has begun some thoughtful work on how you might develop. It seems to me that something that hasn't been developed since 2007 might want a review.
Okay.
It's a challenging time at the moment for everybody, and I think the contribution I can best make at this stage is to carry on with the work of creating a recommendation and a set of observations for this year.
And then, so a challenging time, it certainly is, because obviously there are ongoing pay disputes about the current year that we're in. How could the government end the current strikes?
That is a matter for the government.
Well, it's a matter for government to do it, but what would be the process by which they would do it? Because they'd have to trample over your work for the current report and undo their acceptance of your work, wouldn't they?
I wouldn't make any assumptions about what the government might do. I think it was probably worth saying that when I first started doing this work, there was a 3-year deal in place, which was as a result of negotiations through the Staff Council between the government and the unions. So that's not unprecedented.
Would you like to have seen that put in place for this year and the following two?
There are challenges with 3-year deals.
Yeah.
Sometimes circumstances change.
Like wars in Europe.
Yeah, and a lot of high levels of inflation, so things change. So I think that it's not, there was a particular set of circumstances and an agreement that additional money needed to be put in the Agenda for Change Pace fine, and a series of things over which the employers and the unions could agree. And so I'm carrying on with our work, and I think that we will do our best to make a recommendation, not just for a award this year, but also for the areas where we think there are ongoing concerns and where the case for investment in pay as opposed to investment in technology or infrastructure is an important one to make.
Okay, and then just finally from me, and then Paul Blomfield is going to close. The NHS workforce strategy is much talked of, and we expect that to come in the very near future. Have you been asked, as an NHS Pay Review Body, given how important pay is to recruitment, retention, to workforce, have you been asked for your input into that strategy?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. Ms. Blomfield.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to follow up on a point that we've discussed and in a sense relates to your last questions, which is about a broken bit of the system and your reference to inflation. Because at the time that you were getting your submissions for the 22-3 review, inflation was running at about 5%. At the time, 6 months later, the announcement was made, it was doubled at just over 10%. After a decade in which pay restraint had kind of been grudgingly accepted, and that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back, that mismatch at that point in time when the announcement was made. Now, do you think the best way of dealing with that at that point could have been for you to be given the opportunity to look again at your recommendation? Or do you think that the government should have taken your recommendation in that new context and made a separate decision, breaking with your
that really is a decision for the government.
Okay, short answer. Philippa Hurd, Chair of the NHS Pay Review Body, thank you so much for coming in. David Fry from the Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy Department, thank you so much for being part of this topical session. It has been very, very interesting, and I know there's a lot of interest outside as well as inside Parliament. Thank you for your time. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.